because what you're about to hear is one of those stories that reminds you why some bonds between humans and animals go far deeper than training or instinct. The farmer's market on Hendricks Avenue was packed that Saturday morning. Vendors called out prices for fresh tomatoes and honey jars. Families pushed strollers between rows of white tents, and the smell of kettle corn drifted through the warm air like a promise of something sweet. It was the kind of scene that looked like a postcard, the kind of place where nothing bad should ever happen. Officer Denise Calloway moved through the crowd with her K-9 partner at her side. Brick was a Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of burnt caramel and eyes that missed nothing. His ears rotated like satellite dishes, catching sounds Denise couldn't hear, and his nose worked constantly, pulling invisible information from the air around them. They were there for community visibility, a routine assignment that was supposed to be easy. Shake hands with locals. Let kids pet the dog if Brick was in the mood. Remind everyone that the department cared about more than just sirens and handcuffs. Denise had been on the K-9 unit for 4 years. She knew Brick's signals better than she knew her own heartbeat. So when his body went rigid mid-stride, when his head snapped toward the produce section and his breathing changed, she felt the shift in her chest before her brain caught up. Something was wrong. She followed his gaze and saw nothing at first. Just a wall of shoppers, a woman arguing about the price of peaches, a teenager on his phone. But Brick's focus was locked somewhere in that chaos, and Denise had learned a long time ago to trust him when he looked like that. Then she saw her. A small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with tangled brown hair that hadn't seen a brush in weeks. She was weaving between bodies like smoke, her movements too fast, too sharp, for a child just browsing the market with her family. Her clothes were dirty, a faded pink shirt that hung off one shoulder and shorts that were too big, cinched at the waist with what looked like a shoelace. But it was her face that made Denise's stomach drop. The girl was terrified. Not the kind of scared that comes from losing sight of a parent in a crowd. This was something deeper, something that had been carved into her bones over time. Her eyes were wide and darting, scanning the faces around her like she was searching for a predator she knew was close. Her lips were pressed together so tight they'd gone white, and her whole body trembled as she moved. Denise took a step forward, instinct pushing her toward the child. Brick stayed close, his posture lowered, his tail still. He wasn't showing aggression. He was reading the situation, waiting for her command, but also communicating something in the way only he could. This one matters. The girl glanced back over her shoulder and froze. For one heartbeat, their eyes met across the crowded aisle. Denise raised her hand slowly, palm out, trying to show she wasn't a threat. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something gentle, something that might make the child stop running long enough to listen. But the girl wasn't looking at her. She was looking past her, at something in the crowd behind Denise. And then she bolted. The girl shot between 2 vendors, knocked over a basket of apples, and disappeared behind a row of tents before Denise could even finish her first step. Brick surged forward, ready to pursue, but Denise held him back with a sharp command. Chasing a traumatized child through a crowded market with a police dog wasn't going to help anyone. The girl would only run faster, and the crowd would only panic. Instead, Denise turned to look where the girl had been staring. The market was chaos now. People were picking up scattered apples, complaining about the commotion, pointing toward where the child had vanished. But Denise wasn't watching the crowd's reaction. She was scanning faces, looking for whoever had made that little girl run like her life depended on it. And then she saw him. A man standing near the edge of the tents, maybe 40 feet away. He was unremarkable at first glance. Medium height, thinning hair, a gray jacket, despite the warm weather. He was holding a paper cup of coffee, and he wasn't moving. Everyone else in the market was reacting to the chaos, turning their heads, stepping aside, murmuring questions. But this man was perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the spot where the girl had disappeared. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He was watching. Denise felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. Brick sensed the change in her and shifted his weight, ready for whatever came next. She started to move toward the man, but before she could close half the distance, he turned and walked away. Not running, not hurrying, just moving with the calm confidence of someone who didn't want to draw attention but also didn't feel threatened. He slipped between two parked cars at the edge of the lot and was gone. Denise reached the spot where he'd been standing and found nothing. No dropped items, no cigarette butts, no convenient piece of evidence waiting to be collected. Just empty space and the fading smell of cheap coffee. She looked at Brick, and he looked back at her with those intelligent amber eyes, his nose still working the air. He had the scent. Denise knelt beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying herself as much as him. Her mind was racing, trying to piece together what she'd just witnessed. A terrified child running through a public market. A man watching her flee without any surprise. The girl hadn't been running from Denise or from Brick. She'd been running from him. But who was she? And why was she alone? The market was returning to normal around them. The apple vendor was restacking her display. The kettle corn machine resumed its rhythmic popping. Families drifted back to browsing, the moment of disruption already fading from their memories. But Denise couldn't let it go. She'd seen too much fear in that child's eyes, the kind of fear that doesn't come from small problems or temporary scares. That girl was being hunted. Denise pulled out her phone and snapped a photo of the spot where the man had stood, then another of the direction he'd walked. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She looked down at Brick and saw that his focus hadn't wavered. He was still oriented toward the edge of the lot, still pulling faint traces of information from the air that had already begun to scatter and fade. She crouched beside him and spoke quietly, the way she always did when they were working something important. Her voice was low and steady, even though her heart was pounding. She told him they were going to find that girl. She told him that whatever was happening, they were going to figure it out. Brick's ears swiveled toward her, and his tail gave a single slow wag. Not happy, not playful, but acknowledging. He understood. Denise stood and looked across the market one more time. The girl was gone, vanished into the maze of streets and alleys that surrounded this part of the city. The man was gone too, swallowed by the same urban labyrinth. But something had shifted in Denise's chest, a weight settling into place that she recognized from every case that had ever mattered. This wasn't a routine patrol anymore. Somewhere out there, a child was running for her life. And somewhere behind her, a predator was watching, waiting, confident that no one would notice or care enough to intervene. Denise looked down at Brick and nodded once. He rose to his feet, muscles coiled, senses sharp, ready to work. They didn't have a name, didn't have a case number, didn't have authorization to investigate something that technically hadn't been reported as a crime. But they had a scent trail growing colder by the second, a mental image of a gray jacket disappearing between parked cars, and the memory of a little girl's eyes. So full of fear that Denise could still feel it pressing against her ribs. She wasn't going to let this go. She couldn't. 3 days earlier, the world had been simpler. Denise and Brick had pulled into the Eastmont district just after 7 in the morning, the sun still low enough to cast long shadows across cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. This part of the city didn't see a lot of patrol cars unless something had already gone wrong. The department called it community engagement. Denise called it showing up before the bleeding started. She parked near a corner market with barred windows and a hand-painted sign advertising lottery tickets and cold beer. Brick sat in the back seat, alert but patient, waiting for her to open the door and release him into whatever the morning had planned. The neighborhood had a rhythm to it, one that most outsiders never learned to read. Early risers shuffled to bus stops with lunch bags and tired eyes. Shop owners unlocked gates and swept yesterday's debris from their doorsteps. Teenagers lingered on corners, watching the patrol car with expressions that ranged from boredom to hostility. Denise had been working these blocks for months, long enough to recognize some of the faces, long enough to earn a few nods instead of glares. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. She clipped Brick's lead and let him out, and together they began their slow circuit through the streets. He moved beside her with that effortless precision she'd come to depend on, his nose working constantly, his ears catching sounds she would never hear. A woman pushing a stroller nodded at them from across the street. A man loading boxes into a van paused to watch them pass, then returned to his work without comment. The morning felt almost peaceful, almost normal. They turned down a narrow alley between two apartment buildings, a shortcut Denise used regularly because it gave Brick a chance to check the blind spots where trouble sometimes gathered. The walls were covered in layers of old graffiti, and the concrete was stained with things she preferred not to identify. Trash cans lined one side, overflowing with garbage that wouldn't be collected for another 2 days. The air smelled like rot and motor oil, and something sharper underneath, something that made Brick's stride slow and his head turn. Denise felt him tense beside her and followed his gaze toward a large dumpster, pushed against the far wall. The lid was partially open, propped up by a broken pallet that someone had wedged underneath. For a moment, she saw nothing unusual. Just another piece of urban debris in a landscape full of them. But Brick had stopped moving entirely now, his weight shifting forward, his breathing becoming shallow and focused. Then she saw the shoe. It was small, barely visible beneath the edge of the dumpster, a dirty white sneaker with a frayed lace trailing across the concrete. Denise's heart rate climbed as she processed what she was seeing. The shoe was attached to a leg, thin and pale, pulled up tight against a trembling body hidden in the shadow of the dumpster's bulk. Someone was hiding there. Someone small. Denise held her position and kept her voice low and calm. She spoke the way she would to a frightened animal, slow and steady, no sudden movements in her tone or her body. She said she wasn't going to hurt anyone. She said she was just walking through and wanted to make sure everything was okay. She kept her hands visible at her sides and made sure Brick stayed still beside her, his presence controlled but not aggressive. The shoe didn't move. Denise took one small step forward, still talking, still keeping her voice gentle. She said her name was Denise. She said the dog's name was Brick. She said they worked together and that Brick was very good at finding people who might need help. And that right now, it looked like someone behind that dumpster might be having a hard time. A sound came from the shadows. A whimper, barely audible, followed by the scrape of fabric against concrete. The shoe pulled back, disappearing further into the darkness beneath the dumpster's bulk. Brick took a step forward, his nose stretching toward the hidden space. Denise let him advance slowly, watching his body language for any sign of threat or distress. He wasn't showing aggression. His tail was low but not tucked. His ears were forward with curiosity rather than alarm. He was interested, concerned, but not afraid. Whatever was hiding behind that dumpster wasn't dangerous. It was scared. The child emerged like a creature from a nightmare. She crawled backward from beneath the dumpster, her eyes locked on Brick, her entire body shaking so hard that Denise could see the tremors from 6 feet away. She was skeletal thin, her arms and legs like sticks wrapped in dirty fabric. Her hair was a tangled mess of brown that hadn't been washed in weeks, maybe longer. Her face was streaked with grime and old tear tracks, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who had learned that the world was full of things that hurt. Denise's throat tightened. She'd seen neglected children before, had been the first responder on calls that still visited her in dreams she couldn't shake. But something about this girl hit different. Something about the way she looked at Brick like he was both a threat and a miracle at the same time. The girl scrambled to her feet, pressing her back against the alley wall. Her chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths. She was maybe 7 or 8 years old, Denise guessed, though malnutrition made it hard to tell. She was wearing a faded pink shirt that was at least 2 sizes too big and shorts held up by a piece of rope. No jacket, no bag, nothing that suggested she had anywhere to go or anyone waiting for her. Denise crouched slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. She kept her voice soft and spoke in simple words. She asked if the girl was hungry. She asked if she had somewhere safe to sleep. She asked if there was anyone they could call, a mom or a dad or a grandmother or a teacher. Anyone at all. The girl's eyes flicked between Denise's face and Brick's, calculating, measuring, deciding something that Denise couldn't quite read. Her lips parted like she was about to speak, and for one hopeful moment, Denise thought they might actually connect. Then Brick shifted his weight, just a tiny adjustment to his stance, and the girl exploded into motion. She bolted like a rabbit breaking from cover, her bare feet slapping against the concrete as she raced toward the far end of the alley. Denise called after her, but the words were useless against that kind of fear. The girl hit the street at a full sprint and vanished around the corner before Denise could even rise to her feet. Brick surged forward, ready to pursue, but Denise held him back. Chasing her would only make things worse. A terrified child running from a police dog through traffic. The image alone made Denise's stomach turn. She stood in the empty alley and listened to the fading sound of small feet until silence swallowed them completely. She looked down at the spot where the girl had been hiding. The concrete was worn smooth, like someone had spent a long time sitting there, waiting out hours or days in that cramped dark space. Denise moved closer and crouched beside the dumpster, scanning the ground for anything the girl might have left behind. And there it was. A small piece of fabric, torn and dirty, caught on a twisted piece of wire that jutted from the chain-link fence beside the wall. It was pink, the same faded shade as the girl's shirt. Denise pulled it free carefully, holding it up to the morning light. It wasn't much. Just a scrap of cloth no bigger than her palm. But Brick was already at her side, his nose working the fabric, his eyes bright with focus. He had the scent now. He would remember it. Denise stood and looked toward the corner where the girl had disappeared. The street was empty, the chase already over before it had truly begun. But something had started in that alley, something that wouldn't let Denise rest until she found answers. A child that thin, that scared, that alone, didn't end up that way by accident. Someone had put her there. Someone had made her into this. And Denise was going to find out who. The days that followed blurred together into a single, obsessive rhythm. Denise woke before her alarm, drove to the Eastmont district before her shift officially started, and walked those streets with Brick until the light faded and the neighborhood transformed into something darker and less forgiving. She told herself it was just extra patrol time. Community engagement, building relationships, the kind of proactive work the department always claimed to value. But she knew the truth, and Brick knew it too. They weren't patrolling. They were hunting. The scrap of pink fabric lived in a plastic evidence bag in Denise's pocket. Every morning, she let Brick take a fresh sample of the scent, watching his nostrils flare and his focus sharpen as the memory of that terrified girl flooded back into his senses. He would work the alley first, always the alley, checking the space behind the dumpster like he expected to find her there again. When the spot came up empty, he would move outward in widening circles, nose to the ground, pulling at traces so faint that Denise couldn't imagine how he still detected them. The trail led them through a maze of back streets and abandoned lots, past boarded-up storefronts with shattered windows, through gaps in chain-link fences that had been cut and recut so many times the metal looked like lace, into the shadows of buildings that hadn't seen legitimate tenants in years, their hallways stripped of copper and their stairwells thick with the smell of mold and desperation. Brick moved through these spaces with careful precision, his body low and alert, his breathing controlled and steady. He was reading a story written in molecules and decay, a story that Denise could only follow by watching his reactions. The girl had been everywhere and nowhere. Her scent appeared in fragments, scattered across the neighborhood like pieces of a puzzle someone had thrown into the wind. Brick found traces behind a liquor store where the dumpsters overflowed with broken bottles and rotting food. He found them near a bus shelter where someone had scratched obscene words into the plastic walls. He found them in the doorway of an abandoned church, the heavy wooden doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges, the interior stripped bare except for scattered hymnals and a broken piano that had become a home for pigeons. Each location told Denise something new about how the girl was surviving. She wasn't staying in one place. She was moving constantly, never settling long enough to be found, never trusting any shelter to keep her safe. She was scavenging food where she could find it, sleeping in spaces too small or too dangerous for most adults to consider. She was living like a wild animal in the heart of a city that had forgotten she existed. But someone remembered. On the third day of searching, Denise started asking questions. She visited the corner market with the barred windows and spoke to the owner, a heavy-set man named Gerald, who had been selling lottery tickets and cold beer on that same corner for 22 years. He recognized the description immediately. A thin girl, maybe 7 or 8, tangled brown hair, always alone, always looking over her shoulder like she expected the sky to fall. Gerald had seen her a dozen times over the past few weeks. She came by in the early morning, before the store officially opened, and checked the dumpster behind the building for anything edible he'd thrown out the night before. He'd tried to give her a sandwich once. Just walked out the back door and held it out to her without saying anything threatening or strange. But she'd bolted the second she saw him, disappeared around the corner before he could even lower his arm. He told Denise there was something wrong with that kid, something deep and broken that went beyond hunger or homelessness. He said she moved like prey, like something that had been chased so many times it didn't know how to stop running. He said he'd called CPS twice, but they never found her, and eventually they stopped returning his messages. And then he told Denise about the car. A gray sedan, American make, older model with a dent in the rear quarter panel. It had been circling the blocks for weeks, always during the day, always moving slow enough to scan the sidewalks and alleys. Gerald had noticed it because the driver never stopped to buy anything, never parked, never seemed to have any destination except the route itself. Just circled and watched, like someone looking for something they'd lost. Or someone they were hunting. Denise felt the weight in her chest grow heavier. She thanked Gerald and moved on, but the information settled into her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward into places she didn't want to examine too closely. A terrified child running through the streets. A gray sedan circling the same blocks where she scavenged for food. A man at the farmer's market watching her flee without surprise. The pieces were connecting, and the picture they formed made Denise's skin crawl. She spent the next 2 days canvassing every business and residence within a 6-block radius of the dumpster where she'd first found the girl. Most people had nothing useful to offer. They'd seen homeless kids before, sad as it was, and one more dirty face blended into the background of a neighborhood that had too many problems to count. But a few remembered specific details. A woman who ran a laundromat recalled seeing the girl slip through her back door one night, probably looking for somewhere warm to sleep, though she'd vanished before anyone could approach her. A teenage boy who worked at a tire shop mentioned seeing a gray car roll past at least 3 times in a single afternoon, the driver never looking at the shop but always looking at the spaces between buildings. And an elderly man who sat on his porch every morning with a cup of coffee and a newspaper told Denise something that made her blood run cold. He'd seen the girl 2 weeks ago running through the alley behind his building with tears streaming down her face. And 20 seconds behind her, walking fast but not quite running, was a man in a gray jacket with a phone pressed to his ear. The man had stopped at the mouth of the alley when he saw the old gentleman watching, had smiled a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes, and had turned around and walked back the way he'd come. The girl had disappeared, and the man had driven off in a gray sedan that had been parked around the corner. Denise asked if he could describe the man's face, and the old gentleman shook his head slowly. Medium height, thinning hair, nothing remarkable. The kind of face you'd forget 10 minutes after seeing it. The kind of face that belonged to someone who didn't want to be remembered. But he remembered the license plate. Only partial, he admitted. The last 3 characters, because they'd spelled out a word that made him think of his granddaughter. 3 letters that Denise wrote down in her notebook with a hand that wasn't quite steady. 3 letters that represented the first solid lead she'd found in a week of searching. She ran the partial plate through the system that night, cross-referencing gray sedans with older model years and any kind of flag in the registration history. The search took hours, churning through databases that Denise technically shouldn't have been accessing for an investigation that technically didn't exist. But she kept at it, feeding Brick treats to keep him company while the computer worked, until finally a match appeared on her screen. The car was registered to a man named Vernon Creed. Denise pulled his file and felt the weight in her chest turn into something sharper. Creed had a record, but nothing violent. Petty fraud, check forgery, a string of civil complaints that had been settled out of court. He'd worked for various social service-adjacent organizations over the years, none of them for very long, and his current address was listed as a property in a rundown neighborhood on the other side of the city. But it was his last known employer that made Denise's hands go still on the keyboard. Creed had worked as an administrative assistant for a company called Bright Futures Family Services. On paper, they operated 3 licensed group homes for children in foster care. But a deeper search revealed a trail of complaints, investigations, and quietly closed cases stretching back nearly a decade. Allegations of overcrowding. Reports of missing funds. Accusations from social workers who said children assigned to Bright Futures had a habit of disappearing from official records, transferred to facilities that didn't seem to exist on any map. Denise sat in the glow of her computer screen and felt the pieces finally click into place. The girl wasn't just homeless. She wasn't just scared. She was a witness. A survivor who had escaped from something she was never supposed to see. And someone was hunting her through the streets of Eastmont, determined to make sure she never got the chance to tell anyone what she knew. The next morning, Denise sat in her cruiser outside the address listed for Vernon Creed and felt the first real tremor of fear she'd experienced since this whole thing started. The house was a sagging 2-story structure with peeling paint and windows covered by heavy curtains that hadn't been opened in what looked like years. A chain-link fence surrounded a yard choked with weeds and abandoned furniture, and the mailbox at the curb was stuffed so full of uncollected flyers that they spilled onto the sidewalk like paper snow. Brick sat in the back seat, his attention fixed on the house with an intensity that told Denise everything she needed to know. He could smell something in that place. Something that registered in whatever part of his brain processed threat and fear, and the residue of human suffering. His breathing had changed the moment they'd pulled up, becoming shallow and focused, and his ears were locked forward like radar dishes scanning for signals she couldn't detect. She couldn't go in. Not legally, not without a warrant, not without something more concrete than a partial license plate and a trail of circumstantial connections. But she could watch. She could document. She could build a case that would eventually give her the authority to kick down that door and find out what Vernon Creed was hiding behind those heavy curtains. An hour passed, then 2. The neighborhood around them stirred to life in slow motion. A woman walking a small dog, a delivery truck rumbling past, a group of teenagers cutting through an empty lot on their way to somewhere that wasn't school. But the Creed house remained still, its curtains unmoved, its door closed, its secrets locked away behind rotting wood and rusted hinges. Denise was about to give up for the morning when the gray sedan appeared. It turned onto the street from the opposite direction, moving slowly, its driver hidden behind tinted windows that caught the morning light and reflected it back like mirrors. Denise slid lower in her seat and watched through her side mirror as the car rolled past the house without stopping, circled the block, and came back around for a second pass. This time it slowed even further as it approached the driveway, and for one frozen moment, Denise thought it was going to pull in. But then the driver seemed to notice her cruiser parked 3 houses down, and the sedan accelerated smoothly, disappearing around the corner before she could get a clear look at whoever was behind the wheel. She started the engine and followed at a distance, keeping 2 blocks between them as the sedan wound through a maze of residential streets. Brick shifted in the back seat, sensing the change in her energy, his body coiled and ready for whatever came next. The sedan led them east toward the commercial district, past strip malls and gas stations and fast food restaurants, whose parking lots were already filling with the lunch crowd. And then it stopped. The sedan pulled into the lot of an elementary school. Not a nice one, but one of those aging brick buildings that served kids from neighborhoods where property taxes didn't pay for new playgrounds or updated textbooks. The driver parked near the edge of the lot, in a spot that offered a clear view of the main entrance and the playground behind the building. Denise's blood turned to ice. She pulled into a space across the street and watched as the sedan's engine stayed running, its driver making no move to exit the vehicle. Children were visible through the chain-link fence that surrounded the playground, their voices carrying faintly through the morning air. Teachers moved among them like shepherds, oblivious to the predator watching from the parking lot. Denise pulled out her phone and dialed dispatch, requesting information on any vehicles registered to Bright Futures Family Services. The response came back within minutes, and her worst fears crystallized into something sharp and undeniable. The gray sedan was registered not to Vernon Creed personally, but to the company itself, a fleet vehicle assigned to employee transportation and client services. They were using it to hunt children. She called her supervisor next, speaking in clipped sentences that barely contained the fury building in her chest. She explained what she'd found, what she suspected, what was happening right now in the parking lot of Jefferson Elementary. Her supervisor listened without interrupting, and when she finished, there was a long pause before he responded. He told her to stand down. The words didn't make sense at first, like someone had spoken in a language she'd forgotten how to understand. Stand down. Don't approach. Don't engage. Wait for proper authorization, for interdepartmental coordination, for the bureaucratic machinery to grind its way toward action while a gray sedan sat 50 yards from a playground full of potential victims. Denise argued. She pleaded. She described the girl she'd been tracking, the terror in her eyes, the skeletal thinness of her body, the way she'd run, like something that had been chased so many times it didn't know how to stop. She told her supervisor about the complaints against Bright Futures, the missing children, the pattern of fraud and exploitation that stretched back nearly a decade. But the answer didn't change. There were protocols. There were jurisdictions. There were political considerations that Denise didn't understand and didn't need to understand. All she needed to do was follow orders and let the people above her handle the situation through proper channels. Her supervisor promised that someone would look into it, that her concerns would be passed along to the appropriate agencies, that she should take the rest of the day off and let the system do its job. Denise ended the call and stared at the gray sedan through her windshield. The system. The same system that had let Bright Futures operate for a decade, despite complaints. The same system that had lost track of children who'd been assigned to their care. The same system that was now telling her to stand down while a predator sat in a school parking lot and watched kids play on swings and slides. Brick whined softly from the back seat, and she reached back to touch his head without looking, away from the sedan. His fur was warm under her fingers, his muscles tense with the same energy that was building in her own body. He knew something was wrong. He knew they should be moving, acting, doing something instead of sitting here watching evil happen in broad daylight. The sedan's door opened. A man stepped out. Medium height, thinning hair, a gray jacket despite the warm weather. Vernon Creed looked exactly like the description she'd collected, exactly like the nothing special face that witnesses had struggled to remember. He walked toward the school's main entrance with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be on school property during the middle of a weekday. Denise's hand moved to her door handle before she consciously decided to act. She was out of the cruiser and moving across the street before her supervisor's orders finished echoing in her mind. Brick was beside her instantly. Released from the back seat with a command she barely remembered giving, his presence solid and reassuring against her leg as they approached the school's front gate. Creed saw her coming and stopped. For a moment, they stood facing each other across 20 feet of cracked concrete, the sounds of children playing forming a distant soundtrack to a confrontation that had been building for days. His eyes flicked from her face to Brick's and back again, calculating, assessing, deciding something that Denise couldn't quite read. Then he smiled. It was the smile the old man on the porch had described. Thin and cold, never reaching his eyes. The smile of someone who had been doing terrible things for so long that he'd stopped believing anyone could stop him. He raised his hands slightly, palms out, the universal gesture of someone pretending to be harmless. He asked if there was a problem, officer. Denise felt the weight of her badge on her chest, the weight of her gun on her hip, the weight of every oath she'd taken when she'd joined the force. She thought about protocols and jurisdictions and political considerations she didn't understand. She thought about a little girl running through the streets with terror in her eyes. And she told Vernon Creed that yes, there was definitely a problem. The confrontation at the school lasted less than 5 minutes, but it changed everything. Creed had backup of his own. Not physical, but legal. Within hours, Denise found herself sitting across from a department attorney who explained in careful, measured terms exactly how much trouble she'd created for herself and everyone above her. Approaching a citizen without reasonable suspicion. Making accusations without evidence. Threatening the department's relationship with contracted social services providers. The list went on. Each item delivered like a stone being dropped into deep water, the ripples spreading outward into consequences she couldn't fully see. She was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal review. Her supervisor looked at her with something between sympathy and frustration as he collected her badge and weapon. He told her she should have listened. He told her the system worked better when people didn't try to be heroes. He told her to go home and wait for the process to run its course. But Denise couldn't go home. She couldn't sit in her apartment and stare at the walls while a little girl was still out there, still running, still being hunted by men who had somehow turned the machinery of child welfare into a tool for exploitation. Brick wasn't department property. He was hers, had been hers since before she had joined the K-9 unit, a partnership that existed outside the boundaries of official authority. And a civilian walking her dog through the Eastmont district wasn't breaking any rules, wasn't violating any protocols, wasn't doing anything except getting some exercise in a neighborhood she happened to know very well. They returned to the streets that same evening. The sun had dropped below the roofline of the taller buildings, casting long shadows across cracked sidewalks and filling the alleys with premature darkness. Denise wore civilian clothes for the first time in years. Jeans, a dark jacket, running shoes that let her move quietly. Brick trotted beside her without a vest or official identification, just another dog accompanying just another woman through streets that had seen far stranger sights. She let him lead. His nose worked the evening air, pulling invisible threads of scent through the maze of alleys and abandoned lots they'd mapped together over the past week. The girl's trail had grown cold in the days since they'd first found her behind that dumpster, scattered by wind and rain and the endless traffic of the city. But Brick had been tracking that scent for so long now that it had become part of him, a memory stored in the deepest folds of his brain where instinct lived. He led her east, away from the commercial strips and into a neighborhood of shuttered businesses and sagging apartment buildings. The streetlights here flickered erratically, whole blocks dropping into darkness before stuttering back to dim yellow life. Few people walked these sidewalks after sunset. The ones who did moved with purpose, eyes down, no interest in making contact with strangers. Brick's pace quickened as they turned down a narrow alley between two industrial buildings. His ears snapped forward, and his breathing changed to that shallow, focused pattern Denise had learned to recognize. He was onto something fresh. The alley opened into a small courtyard surrounded by abandoned storefronts. Most of the windows were boarded up, their facades covered in layers of graffiti and grime. But one building caught Denise's attention. A former laundromat, its sign still visible beneath decades of rust, its front door hanging crooked on broken hinges. The woman from her canvassing had mentioned a laundromat. Brick was already moving toward the entrance, his body low, his weight balanced on the balls of his paws. Denise followed, every sense on alert, her hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there anymore. The building's interior was dark, the only light filtering through gaps in the boarded windows where the wood had warped and split over time. She heard the voices before she saw them. Two men speaking in low tones that carried through the empty space like whispers in a cathedral. Denise pressed her back against the wall just inside the entrance and listened, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid they might hear it. One voice was calm, almost bored. The voice of someone who had done this enough times that it no longer required emotional investment. He was saying they needed to wrap this up, that the girl had been loose too long already, that someone was bound to start asking questions they couldn't afford to answer. The other voice was younger, more nervous. He mentioned the cop at the school, the one with the dog who'd confronted Creed. He said maybe they should pull back, let things cool down, find the girl later when the heat died down. The first voice cut him off with a sharp laugh. The heat wasn't dying down, he said. It was getting hotter. And if they didn't find that girl tonight, she was going to end up telling someone what she'd seen at the house on Moreland. And then they'd all be having conversations with people a lot scarier than one suspended cop and her pet. Denise's blood turned to ice. Moreland, the address she'd found for Vernon Creed. Whatever these men were protecting, whatever the girl had witnessed, it was worse than fraud, worse than embezzlement, worse than anything Denise had imagined during her long nights of research and worry. Brick's head turned sharply toward the back of the building, his whole body going rigid. He'd heard something the men hadn't, something from deeper inside the laundromat where the machinery used to run. Denise placed a hand on his shoulder and felt the tension vibrating through his muscles like current through a wire. Then she heard it too. A whimper, high and thin and desperately human. The girl was here. Denise pulled out her phone and dialed 911, speaking in a whisper so soft she wasn't sure the operator could hear her. She gave the address, requested backup, mentioned children in danger. The operator asked for her name and badge number, and Denise hesitated. Then gave both, knowing it would complicate things, but also knowing that response time was the only thing that mattered now. She ended the call and looked at Brick. His eyes met hers in the darkness, amber reflecting what little light filtered through the broken boards. He was waiting for her command, for permission to do what every fiber of his being was screaming at him to do. She saw trust in those eyes and loyalty and something else. Something that looked almost like a question. Are we going to help her? From the back of the building came a sound that made the decision for her. A child's scream. Short, sharp, cut off by something Denise didn't want to imagine. She moved. Brick surged forward beside her, silent and deadly, his training taking over as they plunged deeper into the abandoned laundromat. The floor was covered in debris and the skeletons of old washing machines, their doors hanging open like hungry mouths. The voices had stopped at the sound of the scream, replaced by shuffling footsteps and muttered curses. Denise rounded a corner and found them. Two men, just as she'd imagined. One older, heavyset, with the tired eyes of someone who'd been doing bad things for too long. The other was younger, leaner, with nervous energy that manifested in the way his hands kept opening and closing at his sides. Between them, pressed into a corner behind a rusted dryer that had become her final hiding place, was the girl. Her eyes were wild with terror, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her face. She was smaller than Denise remembered, more fragile, like she'd been burning her own body for fuel during the days she'd spent running. Her arms were wrapped around her knees, making herself as tiny as possible, as invisible as possible, while the men who wanted to silence her closed in from both sides. Then she saw Brick. Her whole body went still, and for one terrible moment, Denise thought the girl was going to bolt again, was going to run straight into the arms of the men trying to catch her. But something different happened instead. Something that made Denise's throat tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. Poise. Long. The girl's eyes locked onto Brick's face and she stopped shaking. She recognized him. She remembered him from the alley, from the dumpster, from the moment when he'd approached her with curiosity instead of violence, and given her the first glimpse of gentleness she'd experienced in what might have been months. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't a hunter. He was looking for her. Denise shouted for the men to freeze, her voice carrying an authority that her civilian clothes couldn't match. The younger one hesitated, but the older one was already moving, pulling something from his jacket that glinted in the dim light. Brick launched himself forward without waiting for a command, 80 pounds of trained precision hitting the man's arm before he could level whatever weapon he'd been reaching for. The impact sent both of them crashing into a row of broken machines, metal screaming against concrete as they went down. The younger man turned to run, but Denise was already on him, her body remembering training her mind had stopped tracking. She caught his arm and twisted, using his momentum against him, driving him down to the floor with her knee in his back. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. And in the corner of the abandoned laundromat, a little girl uncurled herself from the fetal position and crawled toward the only creature in that terrible place who had never tried to hurt her. Her hand trembled as she extended it toward Brick's nose, and he went completely still, letting her come to him, letting her make the choice that would define everything that happened next. Her fingers brushed his muzzle. She let him sniff her hand. And then, for the first time since Denise had first seen her in that crowded farmer's market, the girl stopped running. The sirens crescendoed into a wall of sound that filled the abandoned laundromat like water flooding a basement. Red and blue lights strobed through the gaps in the boarded windows, painting the interior in alternating flashes that made the scene look like something from a fever dream. Denise kept her knee pressed into the younger man's back while uniformed officers poured through the entrance, their voices overlapping in the controlled chaos of a response that had finally arrived in time. Brick remained motionless beside the rusted dryer, his body positioned between the girl and the rest of the room. She hadn't moved her hand from his muzzle, her fingers still pressed against the warm fur like she was afraid that breaking contact would make him disappear. Her breathing had slowed from the ragged gasps of panic to something steadier, something that almost resembled calm. She was watching the officers with wary eyes, but she wasn't running. That was the miracle Denise would remember for the rest of her career. The moment when a child who had spent weeks fleeing from every adult she encountered chose to stay because a dog had taught her that not everything in the world wanted to hurt her. The next hours blurred together in a cascade of statements and evidence collection, and the grinding machinery of multiple agencies finally working in coordination. Paramedics arrived and approached the girl with careful movements, speaking in soft voices that mimicked the tone Denise had used in that first alley. The girl flinched when they came close, her hand tightening on Brick's fur, but she didn't bolt. She let them wrap a blanket around her shoulders. She let them check her pulse and shine a light in her eyes. She even accepted a bottle of water, drinking it in small sips while her gaze kept returning to the dog who sat beside her like a sentinel made of muscle and loyalty. Denise learned her name from a social worker who arrived just before midnight. Mira. 7 years old, according to records that had been buried so deep in the Bright Futures filing system that it had taken investigators hours to locate them. She'd been placed in their care 18 months earlier, after her mother's overdose and her father's incarceration left her without any relatives willing or able to take her in. The system was supposed to protect her. The system had handed her to monsters instead. The house on Moreland yielded horrors that would haunt the investigators for years. 11 children had been living in conditions that made the dumpster where Denise first found Mira look like a luxury hotel. They'd been sleeping on bare mattresses in a basement with no windows, fed just enough to keep them alive, their identities used to collect foster care payments that never came anywhere near their care. Some of them had been there for years, their existence erased from official records, while Bright Futures collected checks in their names. Vernon Creed and 3 others were arrested that night, their carefully constructed enterprise collapsing under the weight of evidence that Mira had provided without speaking a single word. Her escape had been the thread that unraveled everything, the crack in the foundation that brought the whole rotten structure crashing down. But Mira herself seemed unaware of her role in the destruction of the machine that had nearly destroyed her. In the days following the raid, she was transferred to an emergency foster placement with a family that had been specifically chosen for their experience with traumatized children. Denise visited on the third day, still technically on administrative leave, though the tone of her conversations with department leadership had shifted dramatically since the arrests made national news. She brought Brick with her, knowing that he was the only reason the visit would mean anything at all. The foster home was a small house with a tidy yard and curtains that actually opened to let in sunlight. Denise stood on the porch and felt the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her shoulders, all the fear and frustration and grinding determination that had driven her through alleys and databases and confrontations that should have ended her career. She knocked, and a woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair opened the door and smiled like she'd been expecting exactly this visitor. Mira was sitting in a corner of the living room when they entered, her back against the wall, her knees pulled up to her chest in the same protective posture Denise remembered from the laundromat. She looked different now. Cleaner, better fed, wearing clothes that actually fit her small frame. But her eyes still held that watchful quality, that constant assessment of threat and escape routes that Denise suspected would take years to fade. Then Brick stepped through the doorway, and everything changed. Mira's face transformed in a way that made Denise's throat close up. The wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it softened, melted into something that looked almost like joy. She uncurled from her protective position and crossed the room on bare feet that barely made a sound against the carpet. She dropped to her knees in front of Brick and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur while her shoulders shook with sobs she'd been holding back for longer than any child should have to carry that kind of weight. Brick stood perfectly still, accepting her embrace with the patience of a creature who understood exactly what was being asked of him. His tail moved in a slow, gentle wag that Denise had never seen before. Not the energetic whipping of a dog greeting a favorite person, but something quieter and more profound. He was being careful with her. He was being gentle in a way that his training had never specifically addressed, because some things couldn't be trained. Some things could only be learned through the mysterious alchemy that happened when two damaged souls recognized each other across the vast distances that usually separated species. Denise knelt beside them, close enough to touch but careful not to intrude on the moment. She watched Mira's small hands grip the fur at Brick's shoulders, watched the girl's tears soak into his coat, watched the slow release of tension from muscles that had been clenched in survival mode for months. This was what healing looked like, she realized. Not dramatic breakthroughs or sudden transformations, but small moments of trust, building on top of each other like stones in a wall that would eventually be strong enough to keep out the darkness. The foster mother brought tea, and Denise accepted a cup she didn't really want just to have something to do with her hands. Mira eventually released Brick and sat beside him on the carpet, her fingers absently stroking his ear while she listened to the adults talk about things she couldn't fully understand. Placement options, therapy schedules, legal proceedings that would require her testimony when she was ready, if she was ever ready, with no pressure and no timeline that prioritized the case over her recovery. Denise made a decision in that moment, watching the afternoon light fall across Mira's face and illuminate the first hints of color returning to her cheeks. She would visit as often as she was allowed. She would bring Brick every single time. She would be a constant in this child's life, not as a savior or a hero, but as proof that some adults could be trusted, that some promises would be kept, that the world contained people who would run toward danger instead of away from it when a child needed help. The weeks that followed brought changes Denise hadn't anticipated. Her administrative leave ended with a commendation instead of a termination, the department's narrative shifting to embrace her as an example of dedicated policing rather than a loose cannon who'd ignored direct orders. She accepted the praise with mixed feelings, knowing that the same actions could have ended very differently if the raid had gone wrong or if the evidence had been less damning. But she also knew that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting consequences that might include career destruction, and that she would make the same choices again without hesitation. Mira's recovery was slow, measured in tiny victories that most people would never notice. The first time she spoke without being directly addressed. The first time she laughed at something the foster mother's cat did in the kitchen. The first time she walked to school without checking over her shoulder every few steps. Each milestone was a triumph over the darkness that had nearly consumed her, a testament to the resilience that had kept her running through the streets of Eastmont long after most children would have given up. And always, there was Brick. He became the bridge between Mira and the adult world that had failed her so completely. She could approach him when approaching people felt impossible. She could talk to him when words directed at humans stuck in her throat. She could trust him in ways she wasn't ready to trust anyone else, and through that trust, she slowly learned that not everyone who reached out wanted to hurt her. On the afternoon of Denise's final scheduled visit before Mira's placement became permanent with a family who had fallen in love with her quiet strength, the girl did something she had never done before. She walked across the living room without hesitation, stood in front of Denise, and extended her hand exactly the way she had extended it toward Brick in that abandoned laundromat. Denise understood the gesture immediately. She reached out slowly, letting Mira set the pace, and their fingers touched with the gentleness of something fragile being passed between careful hands. Mira looked up at her with eyes that still held shadows but also held something else now. Something that looked like hope. And Denise realized that some chains of trust had to be built link by link, moment by moment, from one small act of courage to the next. The girl who had spent weeks running from everything that moved had finally found the strength to stop and reach out and let someone in. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning.